Today we will explore the conflicts which took place between Titan legions that occurred during a specific period of the Heresy. And this coincides with a newly released starter set for the tabletop Titanicus game, which has released only just this week. Titanicus is a separate tabletop game to the core 40k, and it focuses on the battles between world-ending titans, as I discussed in the last video. The game itself gives you the opportunity to fight these battles or play out actual narrative engagements that are focused on some of the most devastating battles, which often caused planetary annihilation during the Heresy period. The new Titanicus is a little different to the first, as its set contains Reaver Titans, Warhounds and Knights, and brings to us some new lore around the campaigns of Shadow, Iron, and also some other very interesting little details which I discovered and I'll probably put into some other discussive videos. But it also gives us more detail about Psi Titans, which I would also put into a lore gear video to follow after this. Now, if you're curious at all or inspired to try out your first venture into Titanic warfare, check out the link that I provided below for information on both the Shadow of Iron supplement and the Titanicus game itself, and I'll see if I can't bring together some kind of showcase for you later along the line. The Horus Heresy was one of the darkest times, obviously, for all of humanity. Within the Imperium, no one at any level of society really knew who they could trust, and truth was seen as lies, brothers slaughtered one another, loyalists regarded many within their ranks with suspicion, doubts pervaded all things. Exhaustion and paranoia eventually tore entire populations apart, and as the Heresy picked up momentum, ever-intensifying crusades of Titan legions and traitor Astartes would raze entire worlds. Planets once filled with activity would be turned to ashes, and crushed remains of bleached bones littered the ground that was turned to glass by weapons of power beyond the imagination of most. Skulls were turned to dust, blew in the wind. All seemed inconsequential to those piloting the behemoth titanic war machines which strode across planet surfaces, laying down energy and missile barrages that turned the worlds of humanity into dead landscapes, often ruined and bereft of any notable features. For this would be a time of Shadow and Iron, where reckless hatred permeated hundreds of loyalist worlds with conflicts of unrepentant brutality and bitter vengeance. Towering metallic gods of the Imperium fought each other with technology originating from a dark age that none can now recall. In the shadows of these giants, entire worlds would exhaust their last living breaths. On one side of the galaxy, the traitors were tearing apart systems en route to Terra, but there were other campaigns happening across the Imperium. The main second theatre of heresy was primarily the galactic eastern fringe of the Empire, most notably the Ultramar system, home of course to the Ultramarines, the 13th Legion, who engaged with the traitor wordbearers of Lorgar, the 17th Legion, and the World Eaters of Angron, the 12th Legion. The World Eaters, of course, would become one of the few Space Marine traitors to fully commit to a singular god of chaos, and who would eventually align themselves with the blood god of eternal war, Khorne. The Crusades of Shadow and Iron were as brutal as were happening throughout the Imperium, and the inclusion of Titans mirrored what was seen throughout this time of devastating planetary engagements. Hundreds, if not thousands of worlds were scoured during the Heresy. Many would become bleak, defiled planets, often never to see human habitation again. In what became known as the Iron Crusade, you would see titanic warfare spread across the 500 worlds of the Ultramar system, and it paralleled the campaigns between loyalist and traitor primarchs of this time. Titan legions sought to settle their differences that had festered for decades, but now would finally spill out into the open. And all of this was occurring in the Ultramar system amid the brutal campaign of traitor Astartes, known as the Shadow Crusade. And this was a campaign that followed the infamous engagement known as the Betrayal at Calth, where loyalists would destroy a traitor wordbearer's vessel known as the Furious Abyss, an immense starship thought to be unique in its class size, but eventually would be revealed to be one of 3 that had been constructed. They were the largest ships known to have existed in the Imperial fleet, with only the Imperial Fifth's phalanx rivaling them. And they were armed with a prototype weapon known as a plasma lance and psionic charges which could disrupt navigator sensors. The ships were forged by a secret branch of the Mechanicum loyal to the traitors, but despite dealing some damage, the ship would thankfully be destroyed before it were able to attack the Ultramarines' homeworld of Macragge, and thus form the opening of the battle at Calth. Incidentally, at this time, Nathaniel Garrow, the ex-Death Guard, now Knight-Errant of Malcador, would travel here to also recruit Tylos Rubio as he continued his quest to create his selected elite circle of loyalist Astartes who would form the foundations for the Grey Knights. But another critical event would occur during this time as Lorgar, Primarch of the Wordbearers, sought the creation of the Ruin Storm. This warp disturbance would be summoned by Erebus, yes, I'll say it correctly now, during the Calth battle, but although it originated in this time, it needed to be fed with psychic energy in order to realise its true potential. And when we say psychic energy, we mean the torment, despair and suffering of mortal humans. And so, resultantly, the Shadow Crusade would begin and quickly permeate through the Ultramar system. The Wordbearers continued to assault worlds across Ultramar with the goal of ensuring that the Ruin Storm would become fully formed, and this warp storm essentially cut the galaxy in half and would leave the eastern realm of the Imperium cut off. More importantly, it stopped loyalists from aiding the Imperium in Terra, and this was of course the ultimate goal of Lorgar. But the ongoing ferocity between loyalists and traitors would lead to an engagement at the world of New Syria, curiously a world in the Ultramar system which is the original homeworld of Angron, the Primarch of the World Eaters. And the Ultramarines sought vengeance for the betrayal and appalling losses inflicted at Calth. The battle here was waged both in the space around the planet and on the ground. Forces of both Astartes and Titans would engage one another, from the traitor Legio Audax, the Ember Wolves, versus the loyalist Lysander, Sentinels of the Edge, and Legio Oberon. The resulting scale of slaughter and agony emanating from the engagement would lead to the successful growth of the Ruin Storm, which led to only further chaos across the Eastern Galactic Segmentum. They were completely isolated from the rest of the Imperium, meaning that not only the Ultramarines but also the Dark Angels and Blood Angels were forced to gather in the Ultramar system, where Robert Guilliman would enact the drastic decision to form the Imperium Secundus, and this was a fail-safe plan to ensure the survival of the Imperium. That if Terra should fall, this would become the new centre for the Imperium, so as to rebuild it. But Malcador the Sigillite was aware, or at least suspected, that Guilliman might take some action along these lines, and this only further exacerbated the fears and doubts that defined this period of Imperial history. There was great concern that Guilliman, similarly to the traitors, could threaten to somehow break away from the Imperium and the Emperor. The Imperium Secundus would of course be ultimately abandoned, not least as it was controversial and many considered it heretical. Finally, Guilliman, Sanguinius and Lionel Johnson led the bulk of their respective legions through the Ruin Storm in hopes of reaching Terra and aiding the Emperor, but only Sanguinius would succeed in this effort. For the titanic Iron Crusade during this period, the fighting was often so intense that entire legio could be lost in a single day, not to mention millions of Imperial Guard fighting and supporting Astartes. The betrayal at Calth decimated loyalist forces, for on the world of Calth lay the void docks of the city of Ithaca, a principal port for the Ultramar system. Its transport yards contained many hundreds of thousands of Imperial troops, as well as their hardware and of course, Titans. The planet had been preparing forces here for transport, and a significant quantity of Titans were already stored and locked down aboard the transport vessels. Scores of these would perish at the hands of traitors, never having had the opportunity to die amid the glory of battle in service to the Imperium. A massive transport ship known as Arotan made ready to leave the planet, but then it would come under immediate fire by traitors. It was struck down, crashing with a terrible gouging into the city's surface of Ithaca. Further Titans would perish as they were mercilessly preyed upon, and like confused, stunned animals, they were subsequently butchered. The Titans of Legio Sudivora, the Fire Masters, came out into the open for the first time now. They had orchestrated this betrayal, and they rampaged forward to destroy what remained of the Loyalist Titans and their considerably sizable Imperial army support. The Loyalist Titans of Legio Praesidius were rudely awoken to the horror now unfolding all around them. Unsurprisingly, they had little intention of dying quietly. Ithaca would quickly become one of many sites to suffer this kind of all-consuming traitor assault, where during the opening of the engagement, confusion was very much as dangerous an enemy as was the shocking treachery. Princeps and commanders who dared even to hesitate in defending themselves, who maybe paused even for just a moment to wonder by who or why they were being targeted on worlds only stationed with their own forces, and they were not given any opportunity to reach such conclusions. They were slaughtered quickly. But those who did have the presence of mind to immediately defend themselves quickly replaced shock with bitter determination and an all-consuming fury to engage those perpetrators who dared to give such a brazen and disgraceful betrayal. Still, the initial surprise of any such assault was so devastating that many Titans would die simply by their reactors being underpowered and unprepared. Often any void shields that were able to be raised collapsed quickly under fully charged firepower of the traitors. The Loyalist Legio were additionally badly outnumbered, and only the quick thinking of Master Princeps Rico Trieste could save them from being overrun immediately. She understood that using the city itself was the Legio's only hope of survival, not least because of their disorganized and already crippled state. Her assessment led to leading a brave but very obviously hopeless charge with 9 Warlord Titans versus the many hundreds of traitor Titans from the Fire Masters. They strode forth across a battlefield to engage with the hope of delaying the advancing traitors, and Trieste would subsequently fall along with the other 9 Warlord Titans who led this suicidal charge. All were destroyed, but she succeeded in slowing the advance, enabling the remainder of her Legio and their Knight allies to reach the moderate protection of the city. Sacrifices such as these were common in the coming battles of these dark days, and continuing shock assaults led often to impossible situations. Princeps commanders were left to calculate decisions that stood on a knife edge and could doom their Legio and entire worlds to either obliteration or survival. Ithrica burned at the commands of the Prometheum-obsessed Legio of the Fire Masters, and while the Loyalists initially appeared to have slowed the momentum of the traitors, with some even believing that they had caused something of a tactical retreat, it seems inevitable that this was soon to be revealed to be, of course, a mistakenly placed hope. An important detail worth bearing in mind when talking about any campaign that's occurring in an Imperial system is that while this sounds like a smaller area of space, the distances between worlds are still significant, and as a result, communication between forces and worlds of the Imperium is far from being an easy or exact thing. When sending communications between worlds, it's not just like beaming a message that then comes through nice and clear. Astropathic communications, like so many aspects of the Imperium, still require the warp to reach across the vast distances of the galaxy, and this is why something like the Tyranids' Shadow in the Warp is so devastating, as it inhibits not only warp travel but also communication. So anyone sending a distress call from a world may mean that it comes through fragmented or have questionable quality at any time, and this can then take days or even weeks to decipher its specific meaning. Plus, once the detail of a message is approved, it still would have to be debated as to what action can be taken by rulers of a specific world receiving the message. Such is the ever consistently agonizing nature of bureaucracy, because why take an action when you can talk about it and then talk about it some more, and then the thing that you just talked about all lay the foundations to hold a discussion. So during the Heresy period, the considerable disturbances in the warp that was associated with it, plus not to mention the clouded loyalties that were existing everywhere, meant that communications might never even reach those who were meant to hear a message, or if they were, then debate could arise as to the authenticity or the intentions of such a communication. And you must remember that again, many, if not all, were also extremely ignorant about the warp and just what it was capable of by the decree of the Emperor himself. Humans had no concept of just what was occurring initially in the Heresy time, not to mention the concept of Astartes and members of Imperial organizations turning traitor was just simply unthinkable. In fact, the suggestion of such a thing was as likely to be met with your own execution by those that you were trying to protect, as Nathaniel Garrow himself discovered as he pled his case to Rogol Dawn at the inception of the Heresy. And what this all means was that regularly delays and bureaucratic inaction would often occur, and these were delays that could rarely, if ever, be afforded by the Loyalists that were struggling to survive against brutal, heavy shock assaults that caught them totally unprepared. This was the situation for the Loyalist Legio Praesagius on Calth. Their cries for help were met with debate, not action, and it wasn't until many weeks later that the Loyalist Princeps understood the fate of those on Calth. As much as many wanted to save and then pay reckless vengeance upon the traitors, the Loyalists had to decide the best course of action. Some wanted to just dig in and defend the Legio's forge world of Gantz, but it quickly became clear that this was not a lone rogue legio of Titans. They learned that traitor Astartes legions as well as 2 other legio had turned traitor, the objective to defend the 500 worlds of the Ultramar system and if possible destroy the traitors in an ambush became their new core mission. On the forge world of Gantz, Mechanicum fleet vessels began to amass, the semi-conscious Titan spirits stirring within, restless and aware that battle undoubtedly awaited. Their instincts only stirred up their enthusiasm as they lay locked in the transportation bays of countless starships. On the Forge world itself, ancient Titans were worked upon. Some had lain in a criminal state of disrepair and were gloriously returned to life. The forges were entirely filled with sparking lights, heated metal, and anonymous workers scrambling around like ants to make ready for engagements which could define the nature of the system for millennia, if not permanently hereafter. As the Titans of the Praesagius, otherwise known as the Messengers, readied to depart, along with their assembled loyalist Titan allies, their thoughts were singularly focused on the vengeance they would deliver upon the traitors, who had sought to destroy their kind in the most despicable and dishonourable act, and now they would be made to pay for this travesty. The starships left the orbit of Gantz, carrying the gigantic war machines of the Mechanicum. The Crusade of Iron had begun. As far as the Loyalists were concerned, the hunters were now the hunted, and the traitors would soon face merciless obliteration. They stained the glory of all Legio, and they must be exterminated, scoured from the surface of any worlds they dared to walk upon. As sincere a vow of vengeance from the departing Loyalists may have been, it didn't alter the fact that during this time spent deciding just how or what they would do, the traitors had meanwhile been raining down carnage across the worlds of the Ultramar system. The Wordbearers and World Eaters conducted their Shadow Crusade, bringing as much slaughter as they could to further swell and give power to the Ruinstorm. The Loyalist defenders of Ultramar had no real understanding as to the purpose of this campaign. Most curiously, they were often caught off guard as the traitors would ignore strategic locations and plough straight into softer target worlds, slaughtering the innocent, bathing the worlds in their own blood before the Loyalists could even pivot to counter-assault. The warp was by now ever more a tempest amid the pain, anguish and suffering unleashed by the atrocities committed at the behest of Lorgar and Angron. Storms were already becoming worse, and travel even around the Ultramar system itself was becoming difficult. Communication with the rest of the Imperium had by now been lost, but it seemed fairly irrelevant as all of their efforts, especially that of the 13th Legion, were consumed by the devastating engagements taking place across their system. The traitor Legio, though, unlike the Astartes of the War Master, had been focused far more on the strategic sites that would cripple the Loyalists and slow their ability to defend and counterattack against the traitors. So it was not before time that now the Loyalist Titan legions would begin to arrive and harass and engage the traitor Legio. Yet this was not made easy by ever worsening warp disturbances which slowed them, coupled with fractured elements of night houses, some fighting between themselves or just rival houses. Yet it was in defense of the world of Tyros that a new and nightmarish force would appear. Thankfully aligned with the Loyalists of Legio Praesagius, the Titans of black armour and their black bulbous heads, devoid of any notable features, would emerge. They were like a spectre of death itself, and for the traitors, that's exactly what they would be, for these were the extremely rare creations known as the Psi Titans. A Psi warlord titan known as Eurytus infected traitor titans and knights with intense emotional overloads of despair. The vast godlike war machines were effectively crippled just by their emotions. Their void shields remained completely intact, but soon their overwrought state would be their doom as they were savagely broken apart by Loyalists who seized upon the opportunity. Unable to counter such assaults, the traitors were soon fleeing any engagement with the Psi Titans, and they became mercilessly hunted across Tyros. During both the Shadow Crusade and Crusade of Iron, while both Astartes and Titans could be fighting simultaneously on a world, they were largely also fighting their own engagements. Titans were far more concerned about other Titans than they were the tiny ants running around in their shadows. However, this could lead to situations where Titan Princeps totally underestimated the danger that these infantry represented, notably, for example, when the Ultramarines destroyed a Fire Master's, also now known as Legio Infernus, Warlord Titan. The Side Titans as well, impressive and rare as they were, also illustrated not to be the final word on Titanic warfare. On the world of Espandor, loyalists laid an ambush awaiting for the inevitable assault of the traitors. Yet when this came, the overconfidence of the loyalists with their Side Titans led to the traitors wielding heavy psychic infantry forces of their own to shield themselves against the attacks of the Dark Side Titan. And while they did still inflict heavy damage to the warhounds of the traitor Legio Audax, the Side Titan would eventually be dragged to the ground by use of what were known as Ursus claws. This was a weapon that was originally designed for use on the ships of the World Eaters, but a modified version was mounted to some Warhound Titans, and this enabled them to essentially hunt down enemy Titans as a pack and use these large grappling hook-like projectile claws to drag Loyalist Titans to the ground. This was especially effective as being a physical weapon, it was able to bypass void shields, although it did mean they had to get closer to actually engage. Throughout the heresy, these were then adopted by both loyalists and traitors who found that capturing an enemy Titan could be more beneficial than just their destruction. Of course, how easily one could be crewed with an opposing faction and sync with the machine spirit is another matter. It's far more likely they would instead just be cannibalized. Still, it was clear that these rare and terrifying war machines, the Side Titans, would not be singularly enough to stand against the traitors who had already adapted to shield themselves from psychic attacks. And so the Titans were left to continue their battles in typically devastating fashion. As many as half the traitor Audax warhounds were cut down as they strayed into a thermal minefield, the survivors then limping away like wounded dogs under heavy artillery fire from loyalist PDF positions. But the loyalist Titans were still hell-bent on meting out their furious vengeance, and they sought to capitalise on the weakened traitors, coupled with strong security by Titan Hunter tanks. The Warlord Titan Pride of Conor roared into the traitors, its initial strike with a claw tearing the head of an enemy Titan clean off, while simultaneously engaging with its Sun Fury cannon, rendering the betrayers into molten slag. With an unflinching determination of bitter fury, Princeps Commander Vergos aggressively smashed through the ranks of the enemy to her ultimate target of enemy Commander Orkan Rex. Fumbling to react in time, Vergos and the Pride of Conor grasped the head of Orkan's Titan in the mighty Power Claw. With an act of definitive revenge, slowly the claw crushed the head of the traitor commander's Titan. Fire and sparks bursting out between the digitals of the Power Claw, and the crushed metal rolled away while the body of the God Engine collapsed to the ground. Yet Vergos' aggression had been somewhat blinding, and she realised the Loyalists were still badly outnumbered. Thankfully, Loyalist Titans would cover her retreat, some sacrificing themselves, and Princeps Vergos lived to fight another day. Their point had been brutally well made. They would not rest nor restrain themselves. The commanders of traitor Titans knew that they were far from being untouchable. They might command God Engines, but they were not invincible, and they would be hunted with a bitter fury by the Loyalists. The Iron Crusade would span the equivalent of 2 years on Terran time, and Loyalists and traitors continued their struggle of godlike proportions, battling across the 500 worlds of Ultramar. Some were turned into dead wastelands, others defended, some liberated, but a great many more simply burned. The campaign of both the Shadow and Iron Crusades proved difficult to suppress and defend by the Loyalists, primarily because the main objectives of the traitors were not conquest. They needed not to establish outposts or be concerned with limiting damage. In fact, the opposite. They could deploy and rain down apocalyptic fire, leaving cities turned to ash, entire populations of hive cities exterminated, and then just move on. Their goals meant that they could focus on soft targets, leaving fortified strategic worlds completely ignored. And this was problematic not only that it made it difficult for the Loyalists to know where to commit their forces or to react quickly enough, but also that the enemy rarely slowed down. More standard campaigns are usually punctuated with engagements which are tough for an enemy to crack, and this can buy time for the defenders to assess a situation, bring in reinforcements, fortify, formulate wider plans, and so on. And this rarely took place during the Shadow and Iron Crusades. It was a non-stop constant slaughter, one world burned after another and another and another, and truly few of the loyalists knew how such a campaign could really be brought under control. Yet the engagements of attrition between the Titan Legios was slowly wearing down all participants. Toward the ends of the Crusades, both sides were seeking an exit strategy, and it would be the traitor's commander Nier who would ultimately engineer it, deliberately slaughtering whole populations across a string of worlds, his intention being to force the commander Princeps Vergos to bring her Titans to engage him and Legio Infernus in a location of his own choosing. And that location would be Druth II, a desolate radiation-soaked world which inhibited the Loyalists from scanning the surface. Vergos, though, was sure of the enemy presence and deployed 600 kilometers away from the known primary landing site, using the curvature of the planet itself to protect their deployment. As the Loyalists slowly proceeded toward what Vergos knew to be an inevitably massive battle, the Druth star itself would ignite the surface of the world, creating an unimaginable scene of Titans finally engaging fire against each other whilst walking toward their enemy, and the surface of the planet burned around them with radioactive fire. Warhounds raced across the battlefield, attempting to drag down enemy Titans or hit them with distracting assaults in hopes of creating errors in sustaining Void Shield integrity. The Warlords and Reaver Titans sought to exploit any opportunity, while knights below them battled the trench lines and heavily fortified defences, many of which, if not destroyed by the knights, were crushed by the might of the god engines passing over them. As the battle progressed and the Titan forces finally came into closer range, things became ever more desperate and intense. Warhound traitors crashed into Titans with critical reactor explosions, effectively creating a suicide-bombing Titan, which then brought down the larger war engine, consuming both. Multiple Cerestus Lancer Knights approached a downed traitor Warlord Titan whose arms had been severed, its armour melted like wax. The Knights delivered to the traitor a coup de grace, simultaneously impaling it with their lances, igniting its radioactive core. The traitors, though, became ever more enraged and insane, pouring their corrupted minds into their Titans' spirits, and as they descended upon the Loyalists, it seemed as if they might take control of the fight. But as they did so, the dark figures appeared from the Loyalist ranks, the Warlord Psi Titans, who let rip with beams of psychic power invisible to the naked eye, their powerful psychic blades carving through the enemy with no resistance at all. It was as if they passed through the air, but the traitor Titans fell apart. Where the blades met them, they spilled out the internals of their machines, and they might not have been organic, but it was a sight that still somehow seemed disgusting to observe as they spilt themselves across the battlefield, bisected easily by the warp channel powers of the Psi Titans. The traitors could not endure this, and multiple war machines threw themselves upon the dark engines of the Loyalists, dragging them down and tearing them apart. Princeps Vergos Warlord would now finally face the traitor commander Nier, as they exchanged continual salvos of fire, each steadily returning shots with their mighty god machines. Each round hitting their void shields, each Titan struggling to maintain their shield integrity, she was determined that this would end here and now. They would not allow more worlds to fall to these butchers, and they would reclaim the honour of Legio Praesagius that they had lost on that first day so long ago on Calth. Under ever more punishingly timed shots, Nier's void shields would finally collapse under the weight of fire from Princeps Vergos. She would land a final overcharged shot from her Titan's volcano cannon right between the eyes of the traitor's warlord. And with that, it was over. She had defeated the enemy and delivered a final victory that would help alleviate the unending horrors endured by the Ultramar system. Her Titan itself was in a ruined state, to be sure, but no matter, all can be repaired, as the enemy would undoubtedly now retreat. Vergos felt satisfied that all this had come to such a final conclusion between her and the bitter enemy she had hunted for so long. That was, of course, until the unthinkable happened. The warlord of Nier, Mons Ignum, rose up out of the fire. Its faceplate was burned away, and the incinerated remains of Nier on full display like a wretched, shriveled maggot. Whatever remained of Nier was now irrelevant, though. Her own Titan was so weakened it could not survive long under any further fire, and she knew that there was only one thing left to do. She would complete her objective and destroy the Dark Mechanicum's forges here on the world. Druth II had a gravity elevator that extended above her position, and with a final shot from her volcano cannon, the result was a cascade of explosions and a massive gravity shockwave that brought the elevator down to the planet, destroying vast sections of the surface below it and any Titans who were still fighting, including Virgos. As for the traitor Titans, the final engagement had shattered what remained of their unity, and they soon withered away. Despite this debatably Pyrrhic victory, the campaign of Shadow across the Ultramar system was undoubtedly a resounding victory for the traitor legions. This also saw the transition of Angron from Primarch into full demonic prince form as Lorgar channeled his incandescent rage. It also saw Robert Guilliman fail to defeat Angron in a duel, and this coupled with the Ultramarines' failure to contain the heretics at both Calth and the subsequent crusade of bloodletting and burning across the Ultramar system can barely be seen as anything other than a catastrophically humiliating defeat. Thanks to the mass carnage and pain unleashed across the system, the Wordbearers were ultimately successful in strengthening the Ruin Storm, creating havoc across the Ultima Segmentum and dividing the Imperium in half. The Shadow Crusade only ending because the traitors decided they had achieved their goals. The remaining loyalist legions in the Segmentum were isolated from Terra, namely the Ultramarines, Dark Angels and Blood Angels. As I mentioned before, the result of this was that Guilliman would draw the concerning conclusion that his only hope was to make a contingency plan for the destruction of the Imperium in the Solar Segmentum, creating his Imperium Secundus. A troubling decision on many levels, and one that left more than a few questioning his line of thinking here in the period and the circumstances. Were these seemingly reasonable goals the true intentions of the Primarch? Thankfully, these fears were proven to be misplaced, as Guilliman would dissolve his Second Imperium when it became clear it was no longer a necessary failsafe. Guilliman would ultimately become arguably the Primarch who would have the most significant impact on the Loyalist Imperium over the next 10,000 years, writing the Codex Astartes and orchestrating the second founding, of which the Ultramarines Legion was the greatest source of new chapters. He would also of course eventually return to become in the current period Lord Commander of the Imperium. The High Lords of Terra no more, he stands as the sole leader of humanity's galactic empire. As for the Loyalist Titan legions, the darkness of the Crusade of Iron was a period that left them in a crippled, sorry state to be sure. And while they would retreat to their home Forge worlds to recover and repair, the losses on both sides had been catastrophic, but worse was still to come. For the Titan legions, they could not know that the wars of the heresy would become ever more bitter and extreme. The Beta Garmin star cluster would need to be held by the Loyalists, and its battles, including Titan death, would become the stuff of legend. To a degree, they may well eclipse the engagements during the Crusade of Iron, yet these first battles felt more shock, rage and sacrifice to be endured as a result of an incomprehensible betrayal that led to the slaughter of so many Titans and their princeps. The scale of a battle can be large or small, but the bitter desire for vengeance was perhaps never more strongly felt than by those commanders of the Legio Praesagius, the true messengers. As they were one of the most ancient Titan legions, founded on Mars, they embodied the spirit of the Legio, and for them, the dishonourable assault upon their Titans was something that was intolerable and could never stand unanswered. The Iron Crusade had been bloody and costly, and in many ways it was a defeat for the Loyalists. Despite this, the messengers made sure that even though they had been outnumbered and outgunned every step of the way by the Infernus Legio and the other traitors, they dealt back to them consistently more damage than was received. They wore them down and ultimately crushed them. The war for the Ultramar system was a great loss, but the Loyalist Legio had clawed back their honour. They had won their personal battles, but the greatest battles for the Imperium were still to come.